Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Our producer, Dwayne Bishop, suffering from an irresistible urge to play the theme song from the People's Court because what the heck, it's the Law Show on the radio on a Sunday morning. Sterling Fox with you, joined by Joe Murphy and Alex Sayn-Wittgenstein from Murphy Battista, LLP, Vancouver personal injury lawyers, located downtown, by the way, at 650 West Georgia. Joe, you talked about the location on a single floor in a tower downtown, but I suppose the address might help, 650 West Georgia, and online, by the way, friends, yes, at murphybatista.com. We're talking about concussions and brain injuries, and the conversation began, Alex, on the playing fields. And I think justifiably so, because as more and more of us come to understand what concussions and brain injuries are all about, we generally develop that understanding through some kind of sporting experience. We see major athletes struck down in the prime of their careers. Eric Lindros comes to mind, a fantastic athlete, concussed right out of a career. So as we develop an understanding of it, it comes through sports. But where it's more likely to affect most of us is in a car accident scenario, isn't it?
Definitely. I mean, most people, if they're going to suffer a concussion in their life, it's going to be in a motor vehicle accident as opposed to playing on a football field,
sure,
given where that sport is at. But taking your point a bit further, what we've seen is that the knowledge that has been gained from the sports field and the injuries that were suffered there has definitely carried through into the general knowledge about the impacts of concussions, and we see that in terms of how concussions suffered in motor vehicle accidents can also be treated and what their overall impact will be on a person's life.
Alex talked about the whole the stigma, the macho code that has prohibited so many concussed individuals from coming forward and seeking treatment over the years. Mercifully, that is going away, however slowly. On the personal injury side, as a result of a car accident, soft tissue injuries, a whiplash, is quite frequently the source or the beginning of a concussion. Is there such a code or stigma attached to that as there would be in sports, or do we get over that part faster?
I think, Sterling, in a very, very small percentage of rear-end collisions, a concussion occurs. So it's not common from a rear-end collision, but it can happen. And sometimes the rear-end collisions aren't huge. There isn't massive damage to the car.
Right.
But suddenly this person who's in the car has a changed life. So we know that from the mechanics of a rear-end collision, again, the brain is being shaken about within the skull.
Right.
That can expose someone to injury. If they've had a series of earlier concussions, what I know is they're more vulnerable to the effects of another one.
Okay.
But oftentimes the person who has the concussion from a rear-end accident often doesn't understand what's wrong with them and why their life is suddenly so challenging and so difficult, why the relationships are so difficult. And it can take a family doctor a while to sort of go from the sore neck, sore back, headaches to a greater understanding, because you need to sit down with these people and their family.
Right.
And say, tell me what's changed. And often the family doctor simply doesn't have the time to do that, nor is the family doctor talking to the other family members.
When you're in a rear-ender like this, as Joe has just described, and there wasn't a particularly huge amount of damage done to the car. There's no great fenders lying on the road and glass everywhere. So does the insurance company, Alex, go, well, listen, there's only $500 worth of damage done to the trunk of the vehicle here. This couldn't possibly have caused a concussion. Do they draw those equations that way? Not a lot of damage. How could you have a concussion?
Absolutely. That's an argument that's brought forward all the time in motor vehicle accident cases. But there seems to be absolutely no correlation between the amount of damage and whether that person actually suffered a concussion, and the courts have found that.
Are you still required case by case to prove that in an individual basis? If ICBC says, for example, there was $500 worth of damage to the car, Your Honor, how could there possibly have generated enough activity to create a concussion?
It still will occur in some cases, but I wouldn't say in every case do you have to cross over that hump of proving that little damage could cause the concussion.
They're more inclined to accept it now?
More inclined to accept it because they've had to accept it
Sure.
because of case decisions which have just completely negated that argument and said person could walk away from a massive write-off accident with no concussion.
True.
But in a minor rear ender, depending on the makeup of that particular person, the way their head moved in that accident, it can cause a concussion.
Joe Murphy has said sometimes it takes the family doc quite a while to connect the dots from what appeared to be a minor neck thing into a possible concussion and so on. So how do concussions get diagnosed then, typically?
I think it's the realization by the medical community that this person has this cluster of problems that one gets from a concussion. Short-term memory problems, processing speed problems, which means you can't think as quickly as you normally would.
Okay.
Problems with your attention span and your concentration, your ability to sequence making something from a recipe, your ability to plan and organize things, your ability to troubleshoot. Headaches are very common. Sensitivity to noise and light is very common. So when you see some of those in a cluster together, it's likely that there's a concussion there, but the doctor simply doesn't have all the information
right
on the first time they see the person.
Sure.
And oftentimes when I have a meeting, the first meeting with someone who's suffering the ongoing effects of the concussion, I'll say to them, "How are you doing?" And they'll say, "Fine, really well." But it's the family with them at that meeting that I can just tell by looking at them that's not the correct story. The other thing that's interesting about a concussion is it changes how a person functions, but they are usually blind to those changes.
Okay.
So if I have a client who's got a sore knee, they're better than anyone else to tell me what the problems with the knee are like.
Right.
The pain, the limitations.
Mm-hmm.
But if I have a problem with a concussion, the person with the concussion is least able to tell me about the changes. It's the significant others that can talk about what the changes are.
And you describe these symptoms, or you describe quite a list of symptoms: sensitivity to light and noise, and inability to focus and concentrate, and so on. If the individual who has been through the traffic accident or whatever and is demonstrating some or more of these items that you've listed, and if the person isn't able to perceive that something's wrong here, this is just not right, it's not the same anymore. So are those first meetings that you just described a moment ago generally created or arranged by the other family members who notice these changes in behavior and insist that there's more to it than that accident that, and you suggest perhaps happened to you?
Oh, without a doubt. It's usually the family that is the major part of the process, is saying we need to go and talk to someone.
Sure.
I had one woman phone me years ago, Sterling, and she said, "I want to come in with my husband, and he was injured." And I said, "Okay." And I always have a family member, at least one, come with them because I want to get that other information.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "Well, I'll come, but you can't ask me what's different about him now." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Well, if I tell you what's different, he will fly into a rage."
Oh.
And I said, "Was he like that before this accident?" She said, "No, not at all." So that's just the typical situation where the person who's injured doesn't really realize they've changed, and they don't want to hear from the rest how they've changed.
Alex, when someone comes to Murphy Battista for that initial interview, we've got to talk to somebody. It's just, ever since the accident, life is just wrong. It's just not the same. What is helpful for you, the lawyer, who's going to sit down and talk to this group of new people that you've not met before? What is it helpful that they bring to that initial meeting with them to allow you to really get a handle on what's going on?
Well, I think it's their honest and forthright version of what has happened, and sometimes that means having to have a discussion with the family member without the person who's injured in the room.
Okay.
Because in addition to the cognitive changes that we've talked about, Joe has also alluded to that there's sometimes a personality change that you'll see as well. The person is much more easy to anger or act irrationally, perhaps, in relation to certain issues.
Right.
So you want to get as full and complete a picture as possible. So that means gathering the histories from friends, from family, and then gathering the medical records. And then we make a decision on whether this is something that requires a bit more investigation from a medical perspective.
Right. Okay. And Joe, again, it's an American term, but I'm going to ask you about statute of limitations because it exists in Canada, perhaps not in the same words, but we do have a time expiry date after an accident or a critical event in which something has to occur or nothing else can happen. What is that timeline?
The statute here, Sterling's called the statute of limitations.
Oh, it is in Canada, too. Okay.
And the law,
I just watched too many American law shows, Joe. I'm guilty as charged.
The law in BC is that an adult has 2 years from the date of an injury or accident to begin the lawsuit.
Okay.
There's no time limit to end the lawsuit, but the lawsuit must begin within 2 years. Now, there are some rules or exceptions that will extend that, but generally it's a good idea to live within the 2 years. For a child, the 2 years doesn't begin to run until they turn 19.
Oh, okay.
So if you're a child age 2, that time limit doesn't begin to run until the age of 19, so it runs out at the age of 21. But with any accident, the sooner our clients come in the door to see us, the sooner we can begin collecting the evidence about what happened and how it affected this person.
Well, that was going to be my next question, Alex. In terms of timeline, how quickly do you want people to come in? I would imagine the fresher your memory is about the incident in question, the more help you're going to be to a lawyer.
That's right. I mean, often people will come into an initial meeting and think that they have a clear recollection of what has happened. And at that point, they may well have that clear recollection. You meet with them a year later, and you're reviewing what they described as had happened before or what had happened in the accident. And it's amazing how malleable the mind is and how faulty it can be, and things that were said, important things that were said in that initial meeting have now been forgotten in that time. So the sooner is always better.
And Joe, I suppose in terms of some evidence, in many cases, I mean, it's difficult to go anywhere in Metro Vancouver these days and not be on TV. It's a pretty safe bet that wherever you're driving, wherever you're walking, somebody's got you on camera. And defense and lawyers use closed circuit and other security cameras extensively in gathering evidence in these cases, don't you?
Yes. But another example, Sterling, is ICBC will often say, well, you were injured in this accident, but you weren't wearing your seatbelt. So we're going to reduce the payment to you by 25%.
I've heard that, yeah.
Unless you're able to have the car examined or vehicles examined by an engineer, including the seatbelt, before they're repaired or destroyed, it makes it really difficult to deal with that kind of an issue. Difficult on both sides, but of course ICBC, following an accident where they think there's a significant claim in a seatbelt defense, they will have their engineers examine the vehicles. So if the person injured doesn't come to see a lawyer for a year or two, it makes it difficult for the lawyer to deal with that issue. Not impossible, but difficult. And witnesses disappear, they forget. So there's all sorts of reasons to see someone earlier rather than later. I had one case where I was hired 5 years after the fact to deal with an accident. My client suffered a horrific brain injury. He didn't remember anything.
Okay.
So that was challenging. The vehicles were all fixed. The road was changed. That was difficult.
How did you manage to defeat the statute of limitations being hired 5 years after the fact?
He was under 19 when he was injured.
Okay. Oh, so that does any person, any child, and a child in BC is any person under the age of 19.
And there's a further exception, if a person isn't mentally competent, then the time doesn't begin to run. And the time for them is not locked like a child. So if someone, an example, if an adult is left severely brain injured as a result of an accident, the law says the 2 years doesn't apply to them because they didn't have the ability
to understand
make
time.
the decision and move forward and get their lawsuit started through a lawyer.
Interesting.
So, but again, the best rule to live with is the 2-year rule, because if you don't, you're dealing with exceptions other than with children, and it's easiest just to avoid that problem, because if you're dealing with an exception, the insurance company is going to argue the exception doesn't apply, and it just creates one more issue or problem in a case.
We're talking concussions, and brain injuries on today's episode of The Law Show here on CIL 650. Our guests in studio from Murphy Battista, LLP here in Vancouver, Joe Murphy and Alex Sayn-Wittgenstein. And we'll continue with lots more on this after the break.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CIL 650.